The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished hardwood floors of Evelyn Blackwood's Victorian-style home. At 42, Evelyn was a picture of elegance and poise, her chestnut hair swept into a loose bun, her emerald eyes sharp and discerning. She stood at the bay window of her living room, watching as a sleek black car pulled into her driveway. A young man emerged, his movements fluid and confident. He couldn't have been more than 25, Evelyn mused. This must be James, the new tenant she had agreed to take on at the insistence of her longtime friend Margaret. Evelyn's spacious home had felt emptier since her divorce 2 years ago, and the extra income wouldn't hurt. Still, she couldn't shake a nagging feeling of apprehension as she watched James retrieve his luggage from the trunk. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn smoothed her silk blouse and made her way to the front door. As she opened it, she was struck by James's piercing blue eyes and the way his tousled dark hair fell across his forehead. He smiled, revealing a row of perfect white teeth. "Mrs. Blackwood?" he inquired, his voice deep and melodious. "Please, call me Evelyn," she replied, extending her hand. "You must be James." As their hands met, Evelyn felt an unexpected jolt of electricity course through her body. She quickly withdrew her hand, hoping James hadn't noticed her momentary lapse in composure. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Evelyn," James said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Thank you for agreeing to rent me the room. I promise I'll be a model tenant." Evelyn nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. "Let me show you to your room," she said, leading him up the grand staircase. As they climbed the stairs, Evelyn couldn't help but notice James's athletic build and the way his t-shirt clung to his broad shoulders. She silently chastised herself for these thoughts. He was young enough to be her son, for heaven's sake. James' room was at the end of the hall, across from Evelyn's master suite. She opened the door, revealing a spacious bedroom with a large window overlooking the lush backyard. "I hope this will be comfortable for you," Evelyn said, watching as James took in his new surroundings. "It's perfect," he replied, turning to face her with a warm smile. "Thank you, Evelyn. I have a feeling I'm going to enjoy my stay here very much." As their eyes met once again, Evelyn felt a flutter in her stomach. She quickly excused herself, leaving James to unpack. As she descended the stairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn found herself increasingly aware of James' presence in her home. She caught herself listening for his footsteps in the hallway, anticipating their brief encounters in the kitchen or living room. Despite her best efforts to maintain a polite distance, she found herself drawn to his easy charm and quick wit. One evening, as Evelyn sat in her study reviewing some paperwork for her interior design business, she heard a soft knock on the door. "Come in," she called, looking up to see James enter, a sheepish expression on his face. "I'm sorry to bother you, Evelyn," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I was wondering if you had a spare phone charger. Mine seems to have disappeared." Evelyn smiled, rising from her chair. "Of course. I think I have one in my bedroom. Follow me." As they entered her room, Evelyn became acutely aware of James' presence behind her. The air seemed to crackle with tension as she rummaged through her bedside drawer. "Here it is," she said, turning to hand him the charger. As she did, she realized how close they were standing. She could smell his cologne, a heady mix of sandalwood and citrus. James took the charger, his fingers brushing against hers. "Thank you," he said softly, his eyes searching her face. For a moment, neither of them moved. Evelyn felt her heart racing, her breath catching in her throat. She knew she should step back, put some distance between them, but her body refused to obey. James leaned in slightly, his gaze dropping to her lips. Evelyn felt herself swaying towards him, drawn by an invisible force. Just as their lips were about to meet, the shrill ring of the telephone shattered the moment. Evelyn jerked back, her cheeks flushing. "I should get that," she mumbled, hurrying past James to answer the phone. As she spoke to her client on the other end of the line, Evelyn watched James quietly slip out of her room. Her heart was still pounding, and she struggled to focus on the conversation. That night, as Evelyn lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about what had almost happened. She knew it was wrong, that she should put a stop to these feelings before they went any further. But as she drifted off to sleep, her dreams were filled with images of James's intense blue eyes and the warmth of his body so close to hers. As the days turned into weeks, Evelyn found herself caught in a dangerous dance with James. Their interactions were charged with unspoken desire, each stolen glance and accidental touch fueling the fire that burned between them. She knew she should put an end to it, ask him to leave, but the thought of not seeing him every day was more painful than she cared to admit. One Saturday afternoon, Evelyn was in the kitchen preparing lunch when James walked in, fresh from a run. His t-shirt was damp with sweat, clinging to his muscular frame. Evelyn felt her mouth go dry as she watched him grab a bottle of water from the fridge. "That smells amazing," James said, nodding towards the stove where Evelyn was stirring a pot of homemade tomato soup. "It's my grandmother's recipe," Evelyn replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Would you like some?" James smiled, moving closer. "I'd love some. Can I help?" Before Evelyn could respond, James was beside her, reaching for a bowl in the cabinet above her head. As he stretched, his body pressed against hers, trapping her between him and the counter. Evelyn's breath hitched, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked down at her, his eyes dark with desire. "Evelyn," he murmured, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. This time, there was no interruption. James' lips met hers in a searing kiss that sent shockwaves through Evelyn's body. She knew she should push him away, but instead, she found herself melting into his embrace, her arms wrapping around his neck as she returned the kiss with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Evelyn felt a mix of exhilaration and shame wash over her. "We can't do this," she said, even as her body yearned for more. James rested his forehead against hers. "I know we shouldn't," he replied, his voice husky, "but I can't stop thinking about you, Evelyn. I've never felt this way about anyone before." Evelyn closed her eyes, torn between her desires and her sense of right and wrong. "This is wrong, James. I'm old enough to be your mother. What would people think?" "I don't care what anyone thinks," James said fiercely. "All I know is how I feel when I'm with you. You're all I want, Evelyn." As James captured her lips in another passionate kiss, Evelyn felt her resolve crumbling. She knew they were playing a dangerous game, one that could only end in heartbreak. But at that moment, with James' strong arms around her and his lips on hers, she couldn't bring herself to care. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn and James' relationship intensified, evolving into a passionate affair that consumed them both. They stole moments whenever they could, heated kisses in dark corners of the house, lingering touches as they passed each other in the hallway, and nights spent tangled in each other's arms, exploring every inch of each other's bodies. Evelyn knew what they were doing was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to end it. James made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. With him, she wasn't just James's landlady or a divorced woman in her 40s. She was desirable, passionate, and loved. One evening, as they lay in Evelyn's bed, their bodies still entwined, James traced lazy patterns on her bare skin. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, pressing a soft kiss to her shoulder. Evelyn sighed, turning to face him. "I'm thinking about how complicated this is," she admitted, "about how wrong it is for us to be doing this." James propped himself up on one elbow, his brow furrowed. "Do you regret it?" Evelyn reached up to smooth the worry lines from his forehead. "No," she said softly. "That's what scares me. I know I should regret it, but I don't. I've never felt this way before, James, not even with my ex-husband." James smiled, leaning down to kiss her tenderly. "I love you, Evelyn," he whispered against her lips. "I know the situation isn't ideal, but my feelings for you are real. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Evelyn's heart soared at his words, even as a part of her warned that this could only end in heartbreak. "I love you too," she replied, pulling him close for another kiss. As their passion reignited, Evelyn pushed her doubts and fears to the back of her mind. For now, she would allow herself to be swept away by the intensity of their feelings. Consequences be damned. As summer turned to fall, Evelyn found herself caught in an increasingly complex web of lies and secrecy. She made excuses to her friends for why she was suddenly unavailable for their usual outings, canceled client meetings at the last minute when James unexpectedly had a day off, and lived in constant fear that someone would discover their illicit relationship. One crisp October afternoon, Evelyn was in town running errands when she ran into Margaret, the friend who had recommended James as a tenant. "Evelyn, darling!" Margaret exclaimed, air-kissing both of Evelyn's cheeks. "It's been ages. How are you? And how's that handsome young tenant of yours working out?" Evelyn felt her heart rate quicken. "Oh, James? He's fine. Quiet. Keeps to himself mostly," she lied, hoping her face didn't betray her. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Really? That surprises me. When I met him at that charity gala last month, he couldn't stop talking about how wonderful you were. I got the impression you two had become quite close." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "Oh, well, yes, we do chat occasionally," she stammered. "He's a very nice young man. Listen, Margaret, I'm terribly sorry, but I'm running late for an appointment. We'll catch up properly soon, yes?" As Evelyn hurried away, her mind was reeling. James had been at a charity gala? He had told her he was visiting his parents that weekend, and what exactly had he said to Margaret? When she arrived home, she found James in the kitchen preparing dinner. He greeted her with a warm smile and a kiss, but Evelyn pulled away. "Is something wrong?" James asked, his brow furrowed in concern. Evelyn took a deep breath. "I ran into Margaret today," she said, watching James' face carefully. "She mentioned seeing you at a charity gala last month, the same weekend you told me you were visiting your parents." James' face fell, and Evelyn felt her heart constrict. "Evelyn, I can explain," he began, reaching for her hand. She jerked away from him. "Explain what, James? That you lied to me? That you've been talking about me to other people? Do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" James ran a hand through his hair, his expression pained. "I'm sorry, Evelyn. I didn't mean to lie. It's just, I was invited to the gala by a colleague, and I knew if I told you, you'd worry about people seeing us together. I thought it would be easier if you didn't know." "Easier?" Evelyn repeated incredulously. "How is lying to me easier? And what exactly have you been telling Margaret about us?" "Nothing specific," James insisted. I couldn't help talking about you, about how kind and wonderful you are. I was careful, Evelyn, I promise." Evelyn felt tears pricking at her eyes. "This is exactly why this can't work, James. We're living a lie, we're sneaking around, keeping secrets. It's not fair to either of us." James moved closer, his eyes pleading. "Please, Evelyn, I love you, we can make this work. I'll be more careful, I promise." As James pulled her into his arms, Evelyn felt her resolve weakening. She knew she should end it, that continuing this relationship would only lead to more lies and heartache. But as James' lips found hers, she found herself surrendering once again to the overwhelming love she felt for him. For the next few weeks, Evelyn and James walked on eggshells around each other. Though they had reconciled after the incident with Margaret, a seed of doubt had been planted in Evelyn's mind. She found herself questioning James' every move, wondering if he was being truthful with her. Despite her misgivings, Evelyn couldn't bring herself to end their relationship. The thought of losing James was too painful to bear. So they continued their clandestine affair, stealing moments of passion whenever they could, all while the tension between them continued to build. It was a rainy November evening when everything finally came to a head. Evelyn was in her study, reviewing some designs for a new client, when she heard the front door slam. Moments later, James burst into the room, his eyes wild and his clothes soaked from the rain. "James? What's wrong?" Evelyn asked, rising from her chair in alarm. "I can't do this anymore, Evelyn," James said, his voice raw with emotion. "I can't keep pretending that what we have isn't real, that it's just some dirty little secret." Evelyn felt her heart racing. "James, please, keep your voice down. What if someone hears you?" "I don't care," James exclaimed. "I'm tired of hiding, Evelyn. I'm tired of lying to everyone about how I feel about you. I want to be with you, openly and honestly." Evelyn shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. "You know we can't do that, James. Think about what people would say. Think about how it would affect my business, your career." James moved closer, taking her hands in his. "None of that matters to me. All that matters is you, Evelyn. I love you. I want to build a life with you." For a moment, Evelyn allowed herself to imagine it. A life with James, out in the open, no more secrets or lies. But reality quickly came crashing back. "It's not that simple, James," she said softly. "We live in the real world, not some romantic fantasy. There are consequences to our actions." James' face hardened. "So that's it? You're willing to throw away what we have because you're afraid of what other people might think?" "It's not just about what people think," Evelyn replied, her voice rising. "It's about the fact that this relationship is built on a foundation of lies and secrecy. How can we have a future together when we can't even be honest about our present? The only lie is the one we're living right now, pretending we don't love each other," James shouted. Just then, they heard the sound of the front door opening. Evelyn's blood ran cold as she recognized the voice calling out. "Evelyn, are you home? I thought I'd surprise you with dinner." It was Margaret. Evelyn and James stared at each other in horror. They could hear Margaret's footsteps coming up the stairs. "James, you need to go," Evelyn whispered urgently. "Go to your room, now." But it was too late. Margaret appeared in the doorway of the study, her eyes widening as she took in the scene before her. Evelyn and James standing close together, both looking flushed and agitated. "What's going on here?" Margaret asked, her eyes darting between Evelyn and James. Evelyn felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her feet. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. James, sensing her distress, stepped forward. "Mrs. Hartley," he began, his voice surprisingly steady. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Evelyn and I were just having a heated discussion about some household matters." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Is that so? It sounded like much more than that from downstairs." Evelyn finally found her voice. "Margaret, I can explain—" But before she could continue, James interrupted. "No, Evelyn, no more lies." He turned to face Margaret, his expression resolute. "Mrs. Hartley, the truth is that Evelyn and I are in love. We've been in a relationship for several months now." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's face cycled through a range of emotions: shock, disbelief, and finally, disgust. "Evelyn," she said, her voice cold, "is this true?" Evelyn felt tears streaming down her face as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "it's true." Margaret shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I can't believe this. He's young enough to be your son, Evelyn. What were you thinking?" "I love him, Margaret," Evelyn said, her voice growing stronger. "I know it's not conventional, but our feelings are real." Margaret laughed bitterly. "Real? Do you have any idea what this will do to your reputation? To your business? Have you even considered the consequences of this affair?" James stepped closer to Evelyn, taking her hand. "With all due respect, Mrs. Hartley, our relationship is not up for debate. We're both consenting adults, and we don't need anyone's approval." Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. "You may not need approval, but you'll certainly face judgment. I hope you're prepared for that." She turned to leave, pausing at the door. "I thought better of you, Evelyn. I really did." As Margaret's footsteps faded away, Evelyn collapsed into a nearby chair, her body shaking with sobs. James knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her. "It's going to be okay, Evelyn," he murmured, stroking her hair. "Well, get through this together." The days following Margaret's discovery were a blur of phone calls, hushed conversations, and sleepless nights. As Evelyn had feared, word of her relationship with James spread quickly through their small community. She received countless calls from concerned friends and acquaintances, each conversation a thinly veiled attempt to gather more salacious details. Her business suffered as well. Several clients canceled their contracts, citing personal reasons that Evelyn knew all too well. The whispers and stares followed her everywhere she went, making even simple errands an exercise in humiliation. Through it all, James remained steadfast. He weathered the storm of gossip and judgment with a maturity that belied his years, never once wavering in his commitment to Evelyn. But as the days wore on, Evelyn could see the toll it was taking on him. The light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a weariness that broke her heart. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the weight of their situation hanging heavy in the air. Evelyn made a decision. "James," she said softly, taking his hand, "I think it's time we talked about the future." James looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of love and apprehension. "What do you mean?" Evelyn took a deep breath. "I love you, James, more than I ever thought possible, but I can't keep doing this to you. You're young, with your whole life ahead of you. You shouldn't have to face this kind of judgment and scrutiny because of me." James's grip on her hand tightened. "Evelyn, no, don't do this. I don't care what anyone thinks. I only care about you." Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks as she continued. "I care about you too, James. That's why I have to let you go. You deserve a chance at a normal life, with someone your own age, someone you can build a future with without all this baggage." "You are my future," James insisted, his voice breaking. "Please, Evelyn, we can get through this. We can move away. Start fresh somewhere else." Evelyn shook her head, her heart breaking. "And then what? We'd always be running, always looking over our shoulders. That's not the life I want for you, James." As the reality of what was happening sank in, James pulled Evelyn into his arms, holding her tightly as they both wept. They spent the night talking, reminiscing about the good times they'd shared, and imagining the future they might have had in a different world. ###. Chapter 8. New Beginnings. The next morning, Evelyn helped James pack his things. Their goodbye was bittersweet, filled with lingering touches and whispered promises to stay in touch. As she watched his car disappear down the driveway, Evelyn felt a chapter of her life closing. In the months that followed, Evelyn threw herself into rebuilding her life and her business. She faced the gossip and judgment head-on, refusing to be shamed for following her heart. Slowly but surely, the whispers died down, and life began to return to normal. James kept his promise to stay in touch, sending occasional emails and text messages. Evelyn cherished these small connections, even as she encouraged him to move on with his life. She took comfort in hearing about his new job in a different city, his budding friendships, and eventually a new relationship with a woman his own age. As for Evelyn, she found herself changed by her experience with James. She approached life with a new openness, no longer afraid to take risks or show vulnerability. She even began dating again, this time with a clearer understanding of what she wanted and deserved in a partner. 1 year to the day after James had left, Evelyn sat in her garden, sipping tea and reflecting on how much had changed. Her phone buzzed with a text message from James. "Thinking of you today. Hope you're well. Thank you for everything. Jay." Evelyn smiled, a bittersweet ache in her chest. She typed out a reply. "Thinking of you too. I'm doing well. I hope you're happy, James. You deserve it. E." As she set her phone down, Evelyn looked out over her garden, watching as the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. She felt a sense of peace wash over her. Her relationship with James had been intense, passionate, and ultimately unsustainable, but it had also been transformative, teaching her valuable lessons about love, courage, and the importance of being true to oneself. Evelyn raised her teacup in a silent toast to the memories, the lessons learned, and the promise of new beginnings. As the last rays of sunlight faded, she stood up, ready to embrace whatever the future might hold.